guys, my name's Grace Neutral and you're here at my tattoo studio Femme Fatale in East London, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to hand poke mandalas. Let's get to it! Okay, so we're getting into the stencil now. So what I'll do is I'll prep the skin and then I will use a stencil stuff, a stencil solution. I usually use like stencil stuff. There's one called the Good Stencil, and there's also one by Spirit who do the transfer paper. They do a really good one as well. It stays on for ages. And what I like to do is put a layer on and kind of let it dry. I've put a layer on before this as well and did it earlier. Just put a nice layer on, let it dry, and then put another layer on, and then when it's like tacky, that's when it's perfect to put on. You don't want it to be too wet so that it makes the stencil bleed, but you also don't want it to be too dry either. You want it to be like perfect so it clings to the skin. And then I'll take the stencil, and depending on what I'm doing, with something like this, because I've done symmetry for quite a long time, I can kind of just eyeball where I think the best place for it will be. But sometimes you've got to put it on the wrong place to know where to put it in the right place. Just like that. And if you get your customer to stand, if you stand nice and relaxed, yeah, I always get them to stand nice and relaxed, facing forward, just in a natural stance. When I go in with the stencil as well, once I've put it on, I kind of push out from center to the edges, just to press it down a bit, and then you can reveal. Very cute. And then I'll take a piece of kitchen roll and do a little dabby. If I do another dabby, I make sure I go onto a fresh piece, and then I might do like a little wipe around the edge if there's any like shiny bits of stencil. And that's it. And then we let that dry for 5 minutes. Depends on how complex the design is. Something like this I'd leave for like 5-10 minutes. If I've put a really complex mandala, say for example if we've done something like this, I'll leave this on for like maybe 15, just so we don't have any stressful moments with stencil rubbing off. So let's get into it. So what I do for mandalas like this, because this specific mandala doesn't have any hard lines, like all the lines are invisible, if you like. So what I'll do is I'll take a 3 liner, like a type 3, and I will just go around and dot outline everything, apart from these little ornate dots here. Once I've outlined these main petals with a 3, what I'll do is I'll go back to these dots with a 5, just because they need to be a little bit bolder. One thing I think is really important for hand poke is the stretch. I think that's really important with tattooing in general, but definitely for hand poking, if you haven't got the skin stretched well enough and it's not like taut from all angles, then it's when you have issues with it going in the skin and blowout and things like that. One thing that I do as well is when I make the needle, I don't tie it down with tape. It's literally just with this adhesive bandage, so I can change the throw of the needle when I want to. I see a lot of people taping their needles down, and I think that must just be hassle. I think when doing solid lines, it's really important that you know what needle groupings to use for what line you want to do. I would say that if you're starting out doing hand poke and you're starting to learn how to do lines, I would play around with the more like mid-sized needles, so maybe like a 7 or a 9, or like a tight 11, and then so essentially like what I'm doing here is I'm just doing tiny little spaced out dots, but when I do a solid line I would be overlapping the dots, so not doing them next to each other but doing them like a third overlapping or a quarter overlapping, and then it's just a case of like muscle memory and practice, and it just kind of does it naturally without having to think about it. But just take your time, don't rush. Speed comes and efficiency comes with just practice, you know? So now I've done all of the invisible lines around the petals. I will go and get a 5 liner, and I will use this for all these little ornate dots in the center and the middle. The center and the edge, sorry, not the center and the middle, it's the same thing. What I'm going to do just for contrast is use a 3 for the tiny dots in the middle, just so they look nice and cute next to these slightly bigger ones. And as I was saying earlier, like the stretch is so important, especially when you're doing like shading, you know, there's things that you can get away with in shading. You can kind of hide mistakes if mistakes occur. But with things like this, 1 dot out of place is like, could be life-changing for the design. So you have to make sure that when I stretch from left, right, top and bottom. So I'm pulling down and to the side with these two, and then my tattoo hand, I'm like pushing up to create this really taut piece of skin. And then I can see how it's going in the skin. Okay, so that's all of the invisible outline and the ornate dots in the design done. So now, because this design doesn't have any hard lines in it, now all the lining is essentially done and we can start shading. So what I will do I only use black, I don't water down my inks, I just use 1 pot of dynamic ink through my whole tattoo. And then to create the effect of like shading and gradients, I will use different size needles. So for these kind of little wedges here, I will use the 3 that I use to outline it with, and I will do tiny little spaced out dots in this section. And then with this one here, I will do the small dots in the top, use the 3 to create this very fine point, and then fill the rest in with either a 5 or a 9, it just depends on how I feel. So this is just the type 3. Do lots of little spaced out dots. The more you space them out, the lighter it will appear as a section. So this section, once it's healed, will look kind of grey because the dots are very small and they're very spaced out. And then when we get into the other sections, you'll see how I create a gradient. And again, just remembering to stretch it as tight as possible from all directions, because it just makes the needle going in the skin so much easier. And you can see that my needle is at a slight angle. It's never straight like that. It's always at a slight angle, and I'm kind of sewing, like plucking this kind of motion. I'm not stabbing it in like this. The idea is to make a tiny little pocket underneath the skin, underneath the epidermis with the needle, which creates a little pocket, and then the ink slips into that pocket. You pull the needle out and the ink's left there. Always making sure that I've got a nice bit of grease or Vaseline, whatever you use. I use a product from H2 Ocean. I actually use 2. I use their CBD balm and I use their Aquatat as well. I use both sometimes I just use one. It kind of just depends on what I'm feeling, depends what mood I'm in. Also depends on the weather. I find that the CBD one is quite thick, so in hotter temperatures it works better, like on a hot day, because it's quite thin when you rub it across the skin. The Aquatat is good for the opposite. It's gooder on colder days because it's quite thin. It's a thin like cream, so you don't want it to be too hot. On a hot day it'll be running down your glove and onto your arm. It's not ideal. But there are so many out there. I think that that's just kind of what works for you, what you prefer, you know. And there's so many different tattoo products out there nowadays. It's like you can try them all and work out which ones are best for you and which ones you prefer. Because everyone's work is different, you know. The way you treat the skin is different to the way that I treat the skin, regardless if we both do hand poke or not. So your tattoos will heal different to mine, and it's always good to ask the specific artist you get tattooed by how you should look after their tattoo that they've given you. It's always best to follow their advice. So the main difference with hand poke is like, regardless of the shading or the lines, like everything's dotted in. Like I'm putting everything in dot by dot. Obviously we have different types of needles that you can use with machines, and they use it in hand poke as well. You have mags, you have liners, you have round shaders. For me personally, I don't use mags. I just don't really get along with them. I don't like the way that they come out with the way that I hand poke. I think that liners and round shaders work for me the best. But you know, technically, like tattooing a line and tattooing shading with a machine is very, very different. With hand poke it's kind of similar, because there are different, you know, I'll do different speeds, different needle groupings, and different like variations of technique with the way, if I'm doing a line, I'll be shading in a very disciplined way, you know, I'll be poking the skin in a very disciplined way to create a very strong, bold line. Shading, you know, in some respects you have a little bit more freedom within the construct of what you're shading, and that's a bit more like free and loose as far as like the direction of where your needle is going, you know. But obviously there still has to be a lot of control there, because you don't want to go outside the lines. Nobody wants that. So what I'm doing now that I've done these 4, these are finished, so when this heals, this will look like a grey compared to what we're going to do in here. But in these long petals, I want to create a gradient from dark to light. So I'll use in the tips the 3, to do these fine dots, same as in this section. And then once I've done that, I'll use the same needle, the 3, to create a little triangle here, which is very sharp and pointed, which I wouldn't be able to achieve with a bigger needle. And then we just colour in the middle, make it all blend together. I think one of the things that people find most like sometimes hard to get their head round is the noise that the needle makes, like kind of plucking the skin. It's kind of people either are not bothered by it at all, or they're like really kind of bothered by it. It really kind of unsettles them, the noise. It's kind of the psychological idea of what's happening. So I think all hand poke artists work differently. For me, the aim is to get the line or the shading or whatever it is that I'm doing done in one pass. I don't like to, when I'm doing hard lines, for example, like I don't like to go over them 2-3 times. Try and get it in there first time. That way there's less trauma to the skin, and you just have more of a chance of packing it in there the first time and keep going back and back, you know. If you're hand poking like large areas of solid black as well, like I find that using a round shader or a round liner, you get much better saturation, and the black comes out a lot more consistent. Like the packing of the ink is more consistent than it is with a mag. And I'm talking in the way that I'm doing it, like this, you know, like in Tabori, Japanese Tabori tattooing, where they use the long stick, they use big mags, and even with like the Maori and more of like the island ways of tattooing with the tapping on the stick. They use big mags, but what you have to remember is they're using a lot more force by hitting it. They're using a lot more force by pushing with the longer stick. It's kind of like a pool cue, you know? Whereas this, I guess you would compare it to, if you could compare it to anything, it's very similar to Shasenbori, which is a style of handpoke tattooing from Japan. But yeah. So now that I've done these tips, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a tight 9. And we're going to go up here. This is how I would kind of do a hard line if I was just doing, you know, just a straight line on someone. This is a good example of how I would do that. So like I was saying earlier, again with the stretching is super important. Once you've got your stretch, you have your needle in place, and it's just slowly getting them, touching toes, and then we can just fill it in. So you can see the difference from the 9 and the 3. Obviously I'm making a much more concerted effort to have them packed together, where I'm doing the opposite here. I'm making the effort to make them more spread out. But you can really see the difference in the way that the black comes through with the different ways of packing it in the skin. And then when I get up here, I get a little bit lighter, a little bit looser, because we want the gradients to blend really nicely. I think a gradient is probably the only time where I will really take the time to go back and try it. Like I'll do it one time and then I'll take a look and I'll be like, okay, now I need to go back and smooth out this little area. But apart from that, I don't really like to be going back again and again and doing second, third passes, you know? I kind of go through phases with needles. At the moment I really like nuclear, but I can only get them in America, so I bring them back on trips with me. And also quadrant needles I really like at the moment. But I've just been sent this handpoke tool, because usually like I'm very simple and my whole setup is disposable. So I just have a needle on a bar with a piece of wood, which is in this case a tea stirrer, unused, and some adhesive bandage just to tie it down to. And I will always make sure that the needle is flat against the wood, never like this with a gap, always flat against it. And then when I poke, I like to have this on the side or up. I never like to have the wood underneath, because it really, I don't know what the technical word for this, but like it messes with I guess the suspension of the needle, like the kind of kickback that you get from being in the skin. Like you want that bit of give, you don't want it to be completely solid, you need that kind of like bend in the needle. So if you have it this way, when you're poking, that piece of wood becomes like I don't know what you call it. It's in the way basically, and it kind of becomes, what is the word I'm looking for? You know what I mean. And when I do lines, especially like solid lines or little lines like this around the edge, I'll always poke away from me, so the line will always go from, I'll go from bottom to top, or I'll go from left to right because I'm right-handed. if you go back this way, it's a disaster. Right, now that I've basically done all the shading, I'm just going to go around again and just, I can see that like this side needs to be made a little bit bigger, just so it fits with the other side. It's nice and symmetrical. Only the tiniest bit though. Right, now that I think that it's done, I wash it with some green soap, the classic tattoo soap, and then I'll give it a good once over. If I need to touch any other little bits up, I will. And then if it's done, I'll put a little bit of cream on it, give it a wipe and let the customer check it out. So now that the tattoo is finished, what I usually do is I'll sit down and ask the person, have you ever had any reactions to plasters, band-aids? In this case, no. So then I will offer the second skin if they've never had a reaction to second skin, if they've used it, or like I said, a bandage or a plaster or anything that has any kind of like medical glue on it. If they do have reactions, then I'll just put a little bit of cream on it, put some cling film on it, tell them to take it, when they get home, to take it off, wash it with warm soapy water, and then let it dry naturally. In this case, we're going to put this on, so this will get left on the skin for up to 3 days. Some people like to leave it longer, but personally I don't think any more than 3 days. Handpoke doesn't need it because it doesn't traumatize the skin that much. So yeah, this goes on for 2 to 3 days, then she'll peel it off in the shower, wash it with warm soapy water, pat it dry with a clean towel or let it air dry, and then once that's done, I recommend that they use a thin layer of Aftercare. The one that we have here is the H2 Ocean Aftercare, which is really good. And then I give them this little pack which has all the instructions on it. It has all the second skin instructions for what to do if you have this on, and then it has all the other instructions to do for a non-wrap tattoo and what to do after you take your Sanoderm off. And then it just has some do's and don'ts just in general for tattoo healing, you know, normal stuff. Avoid wearing itchy clothing or abrasive materials, stay out of swimming pools, steam room, sauna, no excessive exercise for the first few days, especially if it's a large piece. But yeah, there you go, my friend. Thank you so much for watching my tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something here today. I'm off now to go and see my dogs. Bye.